You can tell who someone really is by how they treat you when they think you're nobody. The low hum of conversation drifted through the upscale Manhattan restaurant, silverware clinking softly against porcelain, warm amber lights casting a glow that made everything feel just a little more expensive than it actually was. And yet Charlotte Bennett stood there in a simple black apron that had been washed too many times, her shoes worn at the edges, her posture calm but distant. As if she didn't quite belong in the world she moved through so effortlessly. Across the room, Alexander. Reed adjusted his cufflinks, his tailored suit fitting like a second skin, his eyes scanning the space with the quiet authority of someone used to owning every room he entered. And when Charlotte approached his table with a glass of water, he barely looked up at first, just a brief flicker of acknowledgement before returning to his phone. But then something in her stillness caught his attention, the way she didn't rush, didn't smile too much, didn't try to impress, and for a second, he studied her, not with curiosity, but with judgment, the kind that came naturally to a man who had spent years being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. "You're late," he said flatly, even though she wasn't, and Charlotte placed the glass down without reacting, her voice steady. "Your table was just seated, sir." But Alexander leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if inconvenienced by her very existence. "Service used to mean something in places like this," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. And for the smallest fraction of a moment, her eyes met his, not defensive, not offended, just observant, like she was filing something away, and then she nodded once, turning to leave, but not before he added, almost absent-mindedly, "People always expect a tip without earning it." And that was when she paused. Not long, just enough for silence to stretch between them, before she said quietly, "Some things aren't about what you expect," and walked away. Alexander frowned slightly, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no bitterness, no attempt to challenge him, just a statement, calm and precise, and it lingered longer than it should have, longer than a waitress's words ever should. And as he returned to his screen, reviewing numbers, projections, a deal worth over $40 million hanging in the balance, he told himself it didn't matter, that she didn't matter, that she was just another server in a city full of them. But across the room, Charlotte pulled a small, worn notebook from her apron pocket, flipping it open with practiced ease, jotting down something quickly before tucking it away again, her expression unchanged, composed, almost detached, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if it had never touched her at all. Yet something about the way she moved, the quiet confidence hidden beneath simplicity, didn't quite match the role she was playing. And though Alexander didn't realize it yet, the person he had just dismissed so easily was already beginning to change the trajectory of everything he thought he understood about power, about value, and about the people he believed were beneath him. The next evening, the rain came down in thin, steady lines against the glass windows, turning the city lights outside into blurred streaks of gold and white. And inside the restaurant, everything felt quieter, more intimate, as if the storm had pressed pause on the world beyond those doors. And Alexander Reed sat at the same table again, not because he had to, but because something about the place, or maybe someone, had lingered in his mind longer than he was willing to admit. He told himself. It was convenience, proximity to his office, a predictable menu. But as his fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table, his eyes lifted more often than necessary, scanning the room until they found her, Charlotte moving between tables with the same calm precision, her presence subtle, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. And when she approached, placing a fresh glass of water in front of him without a word, he spoke before he could stop himself. "You always this quiet? Or just with difficult customers?" And there was the faintest hint of something in her expression, not quite amusement, not quite challenge. "I tend to listen more than I speak," she replied, her voice even, and he leaned back slightly, studying her again, this time with curiosity instead of dismissal. "That does not seem like a useful skill in a place where people expect service," he said, and she tilted her head just slightly. "It depends on what you are listening for." And something about that answer lingered again, like a thread he could not quite pull. He shifted the conversation, almost testing her. "Tell me something then. What would you do if a deal worth $40 million was about to fall apart because the other side stopped trusting you? And it was a ridiculous question to ask a waitress, something he knew, something he intended, but Charlotte did not hesitate, not even for a second. I would ask why they stopped trusting me, she said simply, and he let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. That is obvious, he replied, but she shook her head slightly. No, most people assume it is about money or leverage, but trust usually breaks long before the deal does. You just notice it too late. And for the first time, Alexander did not have an immediate response, his fingers stilling against the table, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he processed her words, because that was exactly what had happened, a slow shift in tone, small inconsistencies, details he had ignored, and he found himself leaning forward now, his voice lower, more focused. And what would you do once you figure that out? And Charlotte glanced toward the window for a brief moment, watching the rain before answering. I would stop trying to win and start trying to understand what they are afraid of losing. And silence settled between them, heavier this time, not awkward, but charged with something unspoken, and Alexander felt it, that unfamiliar sensation of being the one who was trying to catch up, the one who was no longer in control of the conversation. And when she stepped back to leave, he spoke. Again, this time without the edge. What is your name? And she paused, just for a second, before answering. Charlotte. And then she was gone, moving on to the next table as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just shifted something inside him, something small but undeniable, and Alexander sat there a moment longer, staring at the space she had occupied, his mind no longer on the deal, but on a question he could not ignore, because whatever Charlotte was, she was not just a waitress, and for the first time, he was beginning to realize that he might have been wrong about more than just her. The third night he came back. The storm had passed, but the air still carried that faint chill that lingered after rain, the kind that made people walk a little faster, speak a little softer, and inside the restaurant the rhythm had returned, steady and predictable. Yet for Alexander Reed, nothing felt quite the same, because now he was watching, not casually, not dismissively, but with intention, his eyes following Charlotte from a distance before she even reached his table, noticing the way she adjusted a chair for an older couple without being asked, the way she remembered an order before it was repeated, the way she moved as if she had already mapped out every detail in her head. And when she finally approached him, placing his drink down with quiet precision, he did not look at his phone this time. He looked at her, directly. You ever think about doing something else? He asked, the question sounding simple, but carrying something heavier underneath, and Charlotte met his gaze. For a brief moment before answering. All the time, her voice calm, and he leaned forward slightly. Then why stay? And she gave the smallest hint of a smile, not amused, not bitter, just knowing. Because sometimes you have to be exactly where people expect you to be, so they never see you coming. And that answer landed differently, sharper, like a piece of a puzzle he was not yet able to place. And Alexander studied her again, more carefully now. That does not sound like something someone in your position would say, he replied, and she shrugged lightly. You would be surprised what people in my position think about. And before he could press further, his phone buzzed sharply against the table, the screen lighting up with a name he recognized immediately, Daniel Foster, the very man whose silence had been threatening to collapse the deal he had spent months building. And Alexander hesitated only a second before answering, his tone shifting back to controlled and professional. But as the conversation unfolded, something changed, small but undeniable. He listened differently, asked different questions, paused where he would normally push, and across the table, Charlotte remained still, not intruding, not reacting, just present. And when the call ended, Alexander exhaled, slowly, placing the phone down as if it carried more weight than before. They are not pulling out, he said quietly, almost to himself. They just do not trust the timeline. And Charlotte nodded once, as if she had already expected that. Then it was never about the numbers, she said, and he let out a short breath, something close to a laugh. You make it sound simple. And she shook her head slightly. Simple is not the same as easy. And silence settled again, but this time it felt different, less like distance and more like understanding. And Alexander realized something then, something he did not like, but could not deny. He was starting to rely on her perspective, on someone he still knew almost nothing about, someone he had dismissed just days ago, and that realization unsettled him more than any business risk ever had, because control had always been his strength, and now, without noticing when it began, he was giving a small piece of it away. And as Charlotte turned to leave once more, he spoke again, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "Charlotte." And she paused, glancing back at him. And for a moment, he almost asked the question that had been forming in his mind, "Who are you really?" But instead he said, "Thank you." And she held his gaze just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them before replying, "You are welcome, Alexander." And that was the moment everything shifted, because he had never told her his name. The air felt different after that moment, heavier, charged with a quiet tension that neither of them acknowledged, but neither of them could ignore. And Alexander Reed did not leave right away that night, even after his meal had long been finished. Even after the restaurant had begun to thin out and the low murmur of conversation softened into scattered voices and distant clinks of glass, he stayed, his fingers loosely wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his mind replaying the single detail that refused to settle. She knew his name, and not in the casual way someone overhears it, not in the way staff sometimes recognize regulars. There had been intention in it, certainty, and that certainty did not match the role she was playing. Across the room, Charlotte moved with the same steady rhythm. But now he noticed more, the way the manager deferred slightly when she spoke, the way a new server watched her for guidance, the way she seemed to exist just outside the hierarchy without ever challenging it. And when she finally approached his table again, not with a menu or a drink, but simply to clear the empty cup, he spoke before she could step away. "You never asked for my name." His voice calm, but edged with something sharper beneath. And Charlotte paused, her hand resting lightly against the table as she met his gaze. "I did not need to," she said, and that answer, simple as it was, only deepened the question, and Alexander leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "So how do you know it?" And for a brief second, there it was again, that flicker in her eyes, not hesitation, not fear, just calculation, like she was deciding how much to reveal and how much to hold back. "You would be surprised. What people say when they think no one is listening," she replied. And it was a good answer, a believable one. But something about it felt incomplete, like a piece of a story told out of order, and Alexander exhaled slowly, leaning back as he studied her. "You listen a lot," he said, almost to himself, and she gave a small nod. "It is how you learn who someone really is," and silence settled again. But this time it was not comfortable. It was filled with unasked questions, with assumptions beginning to shift, and Alexander realized something that unsettled him more than he expected. He was no longer certain of the roles in front of him, no longer confident in the simple narrative he had created just days ago, because the more he looked, the less Charlotte fit into it. And that lack of clarity, that loss of control, pressed against something deeper inside him, something he had built his entire life avoiding. "You are not just a waitress," he said finally, the words coming out quieter than he intended, and Charlotte did not deny it, did not confirm it. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer before responding. "And you are not just a man who trusts his first impression." And there was no accusation in her voice, no challenge, just a statement that landed with quiet precision. And for the first time, Alexander did not have a response ready, because she was right, or at least she was becoming right. And as she turned to leave, moving back into the rhythm of the room as if the conversation had never happened, Alexander remained where he was, his mind no longer on business, no longer on control, but on a realization that was beginning to take shape whether he wanted it to or not, that the person he had dismissed, judged, and reduced to something simple was far more complex than he had allowed himself to see, and that complexity was no longer something he could ignore. The following afternoon, the city moved fast again, taxis honking, footsteps echoing against concrete, people rushing past each other without ever really seeing one another. And inside a glass-walled conference room 30 floors above the street, Alexander Reed stood at the head of a long table, his voice steady, controlled, every word measured as he addressed a room full of executives who were watching him closely, waiting for any sign of weakness, because in his world, even the smallest hesitation could cost millions. And yet something was different, not in what he said, but in how he listened, how he paused, how he adjusted. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, Charlotte's words had taken root, subtle but persistent. And when one of the partners raised a concern about trust, about timing, about risk, Alexander did not push back immediately the way he always had. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his tone shifting. "Tell me what you are worried about losing," he said, and the room fell quiet for a moment. Not because the question was complicated, but because it was unexpected, and slowly, the conversation changed direction, less defensive, more honest, and by the time the meeting ended, the deal that had been on the edge of collapse was no longer falling apart. It was stabilizing, rebuilding, and as the others filed out, one of his senior advisors lingered behind, studying him with a narrowed gaze. "You handled that differently," he said, and Alexander adjusted his cuff. Almost dismissive. "Different does not mean wrong," he replied, but the comment stayed with him, just like everything else had lately. That evening, without overthinking it, without analyzing it the way he analyzed everything else, he found himself walking back into the same restaurant again. The familiar hum, the same warm lights. But this time, it did not feel like routine, it felt intentional. And when Charlotte appeared at his table, there was no pretense left in his voice. "You were right," he said simply, and she tilted her head slightly. "About what?" And he let out a quiet breath. "About trust." And for the first time, there was a flicker of something softer in her expression, something almost approving, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came. "Most people do not like to admit that," she said, and he gave a small nod. "Most people are not used to being wrong." And the honesty in that moment hung between them, unfamiliar but real. And as she placed his drink down, he added, "I used what you said today, in a meeting," and Charlotte paused, just for a fraction of a second, and she asked, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes steady on hers. It worked. And there it was again, that quiet shift, not dramatic, not obvious, but undeniable, something building beneath the surface, something that neither of them had planned for. And Charlotte gave a small nod. "Then maybe you are learning," she said. And Alexander almost smiled. Almost, because something about the way she said it felt less like a compliment and more like a challenge. And he found himself asking before he could stop himself, "And what about you?" And she met his gaze evenly. "What about me?" And he hesitated, searching for the right words, something he was not used to doing. "You talk like someone who has already learned all of this," he said. And for the first time since he had met her, Charlotte did not answer right away, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window, toward the city outside, before returning to him. "Some lessons are expensive," she said quietly, and that was all. No explanation, no detail, just enough to suggest a story he was not being told. And as she turned to leave once again, Alexander watched her go, no longer seeing just the role she played, but the layers beneath it, the questions that were beginning to matter more than the answers. Because whatever Charlotte was hiding, whatever she had been through, it was not small, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he was starting to care enough to find out. It was not supposed to matter this much, not to a man like Alexander Reed, not to someone who had built an entire empire on clarity, on control, on knowing exactly who people were the moment they walked into a room. And yet over the next few days, something shifted in ways he could not quantify, because Charlotte Bennett was no longer just a passing curiosity. She had become a variable he could not solve, and that alone was enough to unsettle him. The restaurant had started to feel less like a place he visited and more like a place he observed, his attention no longer drifting to his phone every few minutes, but instead tracking her movements, noticing patterns, small inconsistencies, details that did not belong, like the way she occasionally corrected orders in her head before they were spoken, or how she would glance at financial news headlines on a muted television and react almost instantly, as if she already knew the outcome before it was announced, and each time, it added another quiet question to a growing list he could no longer ignore. One evening, he arrived earlier than usual, the late afternoon sun still filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and the restaurant was nearly empty, just a few scattered tables, a slower rhythm, and for the first time, Charlotte was not moving between guests. She was seated at a corner table, her notebook open in front of her, pen moving quickly across the page, and Alexander paused for just a second before approaching, not with authority this time, not with expectation, but with something closer to curiosity. "You always work this early?" he asked, and Charlotte looked up, her expression unreadable for a brief moment before she closed the notebook with deliberate ease. "Sometimes," she replied, sliding it back into her apron, and he nodded slightly, taking the seat across from her without asking. A move that would have felt natural anywhere else, but carried a different weight here. "What were you writing?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes focused, and Charlotte held his gaze for a moment longer than usual before answering. "Observations," and he let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly. "About what?" And she gave the smallest hint of a smile. "About people who think they understand everything." And for a second, Alexander almost reacted, almost pushed back, but instead, he studied her, recognizing something in that answer, something intentional, something layered. "And what have you observed so far?" he asked, and Charlotte tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much to say. "That confidence can look a lot like certainty," she said slowly. "But they are not the same thing." And that landed deeper than he expected, because certainty had always been his foundation, the thing he relied on to make decisions others would hesitate to make. And now, for the first time in a long time, he felt the edges of that certainty shift, just slightly, just enough to notice. He leaned forward then, his voice lower, more direct. "You keep saying things that do not match where you are," he said, and Charlotte did not look away, did not deflect, she simply answered, "Maybe you are looking at the wrong part of the picture." And there it was again. That feeling, that quiet realization building piece by piece, that he was missing something important, something right in front of him. And as the restaurant slowly began to fill, the moment dissolved naturally, Charlotte standing, returning to her role as if it had never been interrupted. But Alexander remained seated, his eyes following her just a little longer than before, because now it was no longer just curiosity driving him. It was something deeper, something more persistent, the need to understand not just who she was, but why she was here. And for the first time, that question mattered more to him than any deal, any number, or any outcome he had been chasing before. The shift did not happen all at once. It never did with people like Alexander Reed. It came in quiet layers, subtle adjustments that only became visible when something disrupted the pattern, and that disruption came sooner than he expected. It was a Thursday evening, the restaurant fuller than usual, voices overlapping, glasses clinking, the steady rhythm of service moving faster. And Alexander sat at his usual table, but this time he was not alone. Across from him sat Daniel Foster, the very man whose hesitation had nearly collapsed their deal, his presence sharp, observant, the kind of man who noticed things others missed. And as their conversation unfolded, measured and professional, Daniel's eyes drifted occasionally, scanning the room, until they landed on Charlotte. She moved between tables with the same composed efficiency, but there was something different now, at least to Alexander, something he could not unsee. And when Charlotte approached their table, placing down 2 glasses of water, Daniel's attention sharpened, not in the casual way of a customer noticing service, but in recognition, subtle but unmistakable. "Thank you," Daniel said, his tone polite, but his gaze lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. And Charlotte nodded once, her expression neutral, but for a brief second, something passed between them, something unspoken, something that did not belong in a simple exchange between a guest and a waitress, and Alexander noticed it immediately. The shift in energy, the slight tension that had not been there before. As Charlotte stepped away, Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes still following her. "Interesting place you chose," he said casually, but there was an edge beneath it, and Alexander frowned faintly. "It is close to the office," he replied, but Daniel gave a small, knowing smile. "Is that the only reason?" And Alexander did not answer right away, because for the first time, he was not entirely sure. The conversation returned to business, numbers, timelines, projections, but it felt different now, less controlled, more distracted, because every few moments, Alexander's attention drifted back to Charlotte, and every time it did, he caught Daniel noticing it too, and that awareness built quietly, steadily, until finally Daniel set his glass down and spoke in a tone that was still calm, still measured, but carried a weight that could not be ignored. "You should be careful about who you underestimate," he said, and Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, and Daniel held his gaze for a moment before answering. "It means that sometimes the people you think are the least important are the ones who understand the most." And there was something in the way he said it, something deliberate, something that suggested more than just a general observation, and Alexander felt it immediately. That shift from curiosity to suspicion, that instinct he had relied on for years starting to activate again. But this time, it was not directed outward. It was directed at something he had been overlooking. When the meeting ended, Daniel stood, adjusting his jacket, but before he left, he added one more thing, quieter now, almost as if it was not meant to be heard by anyone else. "You might want to ask her the right questions before someone else does." And then he was gone, leaving Alexander alone at the table, the noise of the restaurant returning around him. But it no longer felt the same, because now there was a new layer to everything, a new possibility that had not been there before. And as his gaze moved across the room, finding Charlotte again, he realized that whatever he thought he was starting to understand about her, it was not even close to the full picture. And for the first time, the uncertainty was no longer just intriguing, it was becoming dangerous. The next evening arrived with a tension that Alexander Reed could not shake, the kind that lingered beneath the surface, quiet but persistent. And for the first time since all of this had begun, he was not there out of curiosity or habit. He was there for answers. The restaurant was alive with its usual rhythm, but to him it felt sharper, every detail more defined, every movement more intentional. And when Charlotte appeared, moving through the room with that same composed precision, he did not wait this time. He stood, crossing the distance between them before she could reach another table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm, and Charlotte paused, studying him for a brief moment before nodding slightly, leading him toward a quieter corner near the back, away from the noise, away from the audience. And when they stopped, she turned to face him fully, her expression calm, unreadable. "You are asking the wrong questions," she said before he could speak, and that only sharpened his focus. "Then tell me the right ones," he replied, his gaze steady, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with everything that had not been said. "Who are you really?" he asked finally, the words direct, controlled, but carrying more weight than he intended. And Charlotte did not answer immediately, her eyes holding his, measuring, deciding, and then she said quietly, "Does it change anything if you know?" And Alexander exhaled slowly. "It already has," he admitted, and that honesty, unexpected even to him, shifted something in the air, subtle, but real. Charlotte glanced briefly toward the front of the restaurant, as if checking something unseen, before returning her attention to him. "You built your world on knowing exactly where everyone stands," she said. "But what happens when you realize you were looking at the wrong level the entire time?" And Alexander felt that question land deeper than he expected, because it was no longer just about her. It was about him, about the assumptions he had made, the patterns he had trusted. Without question, and for the first time, those patterns were beginning to fracture. "Daniel knows something," he said then, watching her closely, and for the first time, there was the slightest shift in her expression, not fear, not surprise, just acknowledgement. "Daniel knows enough," she replied, and that was when the tension sharpened, when the uncertainty became something more defined, more urgent. "Enough for what?" Alexander pressed, and Charlotte took a slow breath, her voice steady but quieter now. "Enough to decide which side he is on." And that answer did not clarify things. It complicated them, pulling Alexander deeper into something he had not anticipated, something that extended far beyond a simple misunderstanding. "And what side are you on?" he asked, and for a moment, Charlotte did not answer, her gaze steady, unwavering, before she said, "The one that does not underestimate the cost of being wrong." And there it was again, that thread running through everything. The idea that mistakes were not just miscalculations, they were consequences waiting to unfold. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade slightly, the world narrowing to just the two of them. And Alexander realized something then, something that settled heavily in his chest. This was no longer about curiosity, no longer about figuring out who Charlotte Bennett was. It was about understanding what role she played in something much bigger, something he was already a part of whether he wanted to be or not. And as she stepped back, preparing to return to the floor, as if this conversation had never happened. He spoke one last time, his voice quieter now, but certain. Whatever this is, I am not walking away from it. And Charlotte paused, just for a second, before replying. That was never really an option. And then she was gone, leaving him standing there with the realization that the truth he had been chasing was no longer something distant. It was right in front of him, and it was about to change everything. The room was brighter than he expected, not in warmth, but in precision, clean lines, glass walls, polished steel, the kind of space designed to reflect power without ever saying it out loud. And as Alexander Reed stepped into the boardroom the following morning, every instinct he had built over years of control and certainty returned all at once. Except this time, it was not guiding him forward. It was forcing him to slow down, because for the first time, he knew he was walking into something he did not fully understand. The long table was already occupied. Executives, advisors, legal teams, all positioned exactly where they needed to be, and at the far end stood Daniel Foster, calm, composed, watching the room with the same quiet calculation as always. But it was not Daniel who shifted the air the moment Alexander entered. It was her. Charlotte Bennett stood near the head of the table, no apron, no uniform, no trace of the role she had played just hours before. Instead, she wore a tailored suit, sharp, effortless, as if this had always been where she belonged. And for a moment, everything else faded, the conversations, the movement, the structure of the room itself, because the only thing Alexander could see was the undeniable truth in front of him, the one he had been circling without fully grasping. She had never been what she appeared to be. "Good morning," Charlotte said, her voice steady, carrying across the room with quiet authority, and every eye turned toward her, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, respect. And that was when the final piece fell into place, not through explanation, but through presence alone, and Alexander felt it, that sharp, undeniable realization settling in. He had not just misjudged her. He had completely misunderstood the entire situation. Daniel stepped forward slightly, breaking the silence. "I believe you already know Charlotte Bennett," he said, his tone measured. But there was something else beneath it, something almost deliberate, and Charlotte continued without hesitation. "Founder," she said simply, the word landing with more weight than any title needed. "Original architect of the deal you have been negotiating." And the room remained still, not shocked, not confused, just aligned, as if this had always been the reality everyone else had been operating in except him. Alexander did not move, did not speak, because in that moment, there was nothing to defend, nothing to control, only the truth, clear and unavoidable. And Charlotte's gaze found his, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling, understanding. "You asked who I was," she said, her voice quieter now, but still carrying across the space between them. "Now you know." And for the first time since he had built his empire, Alexander Reed did not have an immediate response, not because he could not speak, but because anything he said would come from a place that no longer held the same certainty it once did. The meeting moved forward, discussions unfolding, decisions being made, but to Alexander, it all felt distant, secondary, because the real shift had already happened, not in the deal, not in the room, but in him, in the way he saw, the way he judged, the way he understood the people around him. And when it was over, when the room began to clear and the noise returned in low, controlled tones, he remained where he was, watching as Charlotte gathered her documents, as if she had done this 100 times before. And when she finally looked up, meeting his gaze one last time, he spoke, his voice steady, but stripped of the edge it once carried. "I was wrong." And Charlotte held his gaze for a moment, not dismissing it, not accepting it outright, just acknowledging it. "Yes," she said softly, and there was no cruelty in it, only truth. And as she turned to leave, she added one final thing. "The question is what you do now that you know." And that was the moment everything settled, not into certainty, but into something far more real, the understanding that respect was not given by position, that clarity did not come from assumption, and that the person he had overlooked had not just changed